These things I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good morning again. If it is your first week here, we are in the second week of a sermon series through the book of James. Book of James, if you're not familiar with it, it's a Bible book. It's in the Bible. It's towards the back of your Bible by Revelation. It's a very little book. It's only 5 chapters, but it's just packed full of wisdom. I recommend if you get a chance to read through James. James is a very easy book to read, especially for people who like to think, well, the Bible doesn't make any sense. Well, James makes sense. And a lot of the stuff that James talks about is just stuff that we all deal with every day, and stuff that as a Christian you have to figure out. That's what last week was about, the different trials that we go through, and how things will hit us sometimes that we don't expect, and how we have to endure and get through that. And James, this week, he's going to talk more about temptation, still working through that first chapter, and again, how we have to deal with that, and strategies that will help you get through it, and how serious it all is. And whenever any sermon on temptation where that's the main topic or main thought, it reminds me of a story, and it's my favorite story. Of all the stories that I tell, period, it's my favorite, mostly because it's such a evocative. I can picture what it would be like to be in there, and what it would like to be in that room and be a part of it. And it was told by a guy named Gary Richmond, who I don't know if Gary's still speaking or not. He was popular in California, spoke at a lot of different things out there, and I got to hear him a couple times. And but just a fantastic storyteller. And he was a zookeeper for a long time. I mean, for the first 30 years of his life, he was a zookeeper in the San Diego Zoo, which is just an amazing zoo. You can't really get through the San Diego Zoo in one day and see everything. It's just so big. It takes forever to get through it. And he spent a lot of time there as a zookeeper, and he's got all these animal stories, and they're all fantastic about lions and polar bears and monkeys and everything else. But he's got one story that's my very favorite, and I've told it before. I know that I have, but it's just a good story. So even if you've heard it before, just indulge me. It won't take that long. I'm an old man, and I repeat myself the older I get. So just bear with me as we chew through this thing together, because I think it's an important story. He talks about one of the first jobs he had at the zoo was to be the veterinarian's assistant. And most of that was just taking care of, big animals that were sick, and his job was to go in there and hand different tools or whatever, and to the veterinarian. He very rarely had to help with restraining whatever animal it was, but sometimes he did. And just be an assistant, take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. And every so often, they would get a call to go to the reptile house. And San Diego, if you go to the San Diego Zoo, right at the very entrance there, the reptile house is there. I don't like snakes. Snakes bother me a lot, and so I never even liked to go into the reptile house. Them being behind glass didn't make me feel confident at all. But it's crowded, and if you like that sort of thing, it's a very good reptile house. A lot of snakes there, and a lot of very dangerous snakes. And for a long time, the pride of their exhibit was this king cobra. It was 13 feet long, just a monster of a snake. And they had it in there, and it was an irritable snake. If the little boys would peck on the windows, sometimes it would get mad about that and puff up, and that's of course that's popular. People want to see that, and if it's behind the glass, and then sometimes it would get close enough that you could see its face, the cobra, and it had a scar over its eye that he had gotten in a fight, they think, with a mongoose before they had taken him to the zoo, and had gotten in a fight there, had a scar over his eye, and so he looked mean and sinister and not nice like the other cobras. And so people would want to come see this animal. But for the zookeepers, for the veterinarians, it was a pain, because when it would shed its skin, snakes don't have eyelids, and the eye cap on the eye above where the scar was at, where below the scar was at, it wouldn't come off. And so they would get this call every time the cobra shed its skin. Looks like it's not come off again. It looks infected. You need to come do it. And so they would set up an appointment, and they would go have to remove this eye cap on the king cobra, which is another reason why I'll never be a zoo veterinarian. I don't think I could do that for $1 million. But anyway, they did it, and they had to do it ever so often. And so there was only one or two guys, I think there was 2 guys in the San Diego Zoo who were even licensed to handle the cobra. The very most poisonous snakes, you had to have all this training and certification, and this was the most poisonous snake they had. And so only a couple guys could handle it. And the head guy was there, the head herpetologist, he's there. And he's got 2 assistants who are also trained in snakes, and they're off to either side there. So the cage is here in front of him, and he stands there about a few feet outside the cage, the main guy. And then his 2 assistants are there, and they've got butterfly nets on a 2-foot handle, and they're ready to help catch the snake. And then the veterinarian and Gary were over here. And the herpetologist nods, and they raise the cage. Well, it's all about 2 feet up off the ground, all the cages are. And so the cage door raises up, and the cobra pretty quickly comes back to the back of the cage and immediately sees him, and the hood comes out, and he gets real big like they do. But he's almost eye level because he's already 2 feet high, right? And he's almost eye level when he's dancing back and forth there, and he's just trembling with rage. And so they just wait. The main guy just waits, and the guys with the nets just wait as the cobra sizes up who he's going to strike at. And as fast as lightning, he lunges out of the cage, strikes at the head guy. Well, the 2 guys with the butterfly nets, they hit him quickly with that. He goes to the nets, and the head zookeeper gets him right behind his venom sacs and puts him on the ground. And the other 2 guys come in, and they hold him down there. Let's just get this over with, says the zookeeper. So they all come together, and they start working on it. Well, after he's been working on it about 10 minutes, everybody's sweaty, everybody's nervous. It's a very dangerous animal. He says to Gary, the assistant, he says, do you have any cuts on your hands? He goes, no, they look good. Well, look close. Yeah, they look fine. He says, well, go get a big wad of paper towels, as many paper towels as you can jam into a softball-sized wad as you can. So he does it, comes back, says, what do you want me to do? Well, put it in the snake's mouth. What? Yeah. And so he said, well, look at your hands, no cuts, right? And he said, I really did look now. I wanted to make sure there were no cuts anywhere, and I didn't see any. So I got as close as I could to the mouth of the snake, and I put it in there, and he starts chomping on it. And the whole wad of paper towels goes yellow with the venom. And the head snake guy there says, a cobra in the jungle can drop an elephant. There's records of that happening. And if you could spread one cobra bite out, he could kill 1,000 men in one bite. And if he bit me with a full venom sac, it wouldn't matter if the medicine's right here. There's no way I would survive it. And my hands are cramping, and it's been a hard 10 minutes, and I just want to make sure we empty those out. And Gary was kind of glad we were emptying them out, too, at that point. And so he kind of stands farther back, and they finally get the big animal up, and they put him back in the cage, and everything works out. These are all trained guys, and nobody's bit. But as they close the cage and they're walking away, the head herpetologist says to Gary, those big snakes are easy to catch if you know how. They're just hard to let go of. And I thought of that as an illustration for temptation. I just think that's such a great illustration. Any fool can get into temptation. It just takes one more beer, 10 more minutes, I'll be right there. Just give me a few more minutes watching this, or a few more minutes hanging out with these people, or just go see the wrong person. Just spend a little it's easy. Anybody in the world can get into temptation. Doesn't take that much effort. Doesn't take that much work. Anybody can fall into it. It's like a fish. He sees the spinner and he sees the lure, but he doesn't see the hook. Anybody can get into it. It's just hard to get away from it once you get into it. And sometimes in trying to get away from it, you'll lie and you'll tell stories. Sometimes in trying to get away from it, you'll get angry and try to scare everybody else. You'll get defensive. You might stonewall, where you just get real quiet and hard to deal with. You might lose some relationships. Sometimes you'll get into a temptation that might to you seem like a little thing, but to them seems like such a big thing. And to one of your friends or somebody closer than a friend, they'll say, I just can't love you anymore because you did this. I don't think I'll ever be able to get over this break of trust. And you had no idea beforehand it was that big a deal, but it was, and now you're in it, and now you can't get out. And almost everybody in the room knows what that's like. Maybe not about something gigantic, or maybe it is gigantic to you, It doesn't have to be life-altering, though sometimes it can be. Almost everybody in here knows what that's like, just to say just a little too much. Just to be a little too insensitive, just to be a little too stoned, or a little too lustful, or angry, or greedy, or proud, and all of a sudden you've lost some big thing, and you had no idea you were going to lose that big thing. And so James, what we're looking in, we're studying about these few weeks. James is of the opinion, and really almost the entire ancient world agreed with this opinion. James isn't saying anything real revolutionary here. Today it sounds revolutionary, but in James's day, everybody pretty much agreed with it, that there is a right way to live. And that wisdom is figuring out the right way. But it's obvious, James thought, that there's a right way. There's a right, and he actually, last week, the very last verse that we did was that. It is, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial and stood the test, because that person will receive a crown of life that the Lord's promised to those who love him. So he compares it to a race, right? You stayed the course, he says. You're going to get the crown. You've stood the test, and now you've won because there's a way to go. There's a right way to go and a wrong way, and you stayed on the right way even when it was hard. That's what that verse was, and we looked at that last week. And what he's saying there, again, for that day was just common sense. Everybody agreed with that. There's not 1,000 right ways. There's a right way. And what you want to devote yourself to as a person of wisdom is trying to figure out what that is. And once you figure out it's not what I say. It's not what I say. I violate it too. I mean, this week there's been a couple different times where I would like to have that back, and I wish I could do it different, and I can't believe I did that, and it happens, right? It's what God says. And God tells us there's a certain way to go and there's a certain way to be, and we hopefully, as people of wisdom, will find that way and run that course and try to get there. Now, last week, we spent all of our time, that second line there, the second word, trial. We really looked at that word trial, and it's a Greek word, perismos, and parosmos, excuse me, and it means trial, but it can also mean temptation. Now, last week, the NIV and actually most Bible translations will translate it trial or test. But then, that was verses 1 to 12. But then when that same word is used, perismos, when they use that same word in the next few verses, 13, 14, 15, they'll start translating it temptation. The same word, and both times it means it's an obstacle, right? You're running the race, and then there's this obstacle. And sometimes it's a trial, and sometimes it's a temptation. And even though it's an obstacle either way, how you approach it's different based on the context. And the NIV and most Bible translations know that, and so they translate this one word different. And we still do that today. There can be English words that mean one thing in this context and mean a completely different thing in another context. I was talking to my son, Mark. He's a minister in Bloomington, and we were having this conversation. And he said, it's like if you butt dial somebody, like you have your phone in your pocket, and you butt dial somebody, that means an entirely different thing than a booty call. Now, butt and booty mean the same thing, and dial and call mean the same thing. But the context of it changes the entire meaning. And if you don't know what a booty call is, ask your neighbor. Maybe they can illuminate you on that. But it means a completely different thing, right? It's not the same deal. Same words, it just means something completely different in a different context. Okay, well, that same idea is going to pop up here in verse 13. He says, when tempted, and he's using that same word for trial, right? So when an obstacle hits you, but it's not the same kind of obstacle. We were talking about it before. This is more of a temptation to give up on God. It's a temptation to go away from that one course of wisdom that you know. It's a temptation to violate whatever the rule is that you know is the rule and you don't want to do it anymore. When tempted, he says, no one should say, God's tempting me. Because God can't be tempted by evil. And he doesn't tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So he's saying God never puts that kind of stuff. Now, God allows obstacles to get in front of you. He does. God allows some things to get in front of you that are hard. And at some level, God allows temptation to get in front of you. But it's never God's hope that you're going to give up on him. None of those things are designed to produce that result. And so when tempted, you can't blame God for it. And I think he's thinking here of an addict, or of somebody who's gotten too deeply into a relationship they shouldn't have gotten into, or somebody who's gotten too deeply into some pattern of sin, and now to get out of it is going to be so hard, and you want to say, well, God just made me like this, or maybe this is God's fault somehow that I'm doing this. Maybe God, has some other weird plan for me that's not the same as everybody else. Maybe my life maybe I'm the exception. Everybody else needs to do this, but I'm the one. And you'd never say that stuff out loud because you know how arrogant it sounds, but we can kind of approach things that way without thinking about it. We can kind of lead into those things without really fully formulating them in our head. And James says you should never think that way. He says, on the other hand, what happens is we get enticed by it. And again, it's that language of a hunter or a fisherman, the enticed language. Mom and Dad had a groundhog get under their porch last year, and they've tried for a year every different home remedy to get rid of groundhogs, and they have the little cage set up, but the groundhog just goes around the cage, and we put all sorts of different bait in there. And had somebody tell me a few weeks ago, peaches Peaches are the trick. Groundhogs just love peaches. Who knew? So we've tried peaches. So far, the groundhog has been able to resist that deal. I mentioned it first service and said this same thing, and somebody came to me. The only thing they came to me, the only person who talked to me about the sermon at all, first service, came to me afterward and said, peanut butter. And then they walked away. And I didn't know what they were talking about at first. Like, about the bite. So I'm going to tell my mom and dad, if you're watching, peanut butter. That's the one that you need to try. That I've heard that works really well. And because you want to find the right bait, right? And the devil's all the time looking for the right bait, but you have to bite it. He can't make you sin. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, no temptations overcome you except what's common to man. And God's faithful. He always provides a way out. The devil can't make you do anything. All he can do is put the bait in front of you. And he'll do that. And I don't think the devil's very creative. He might put the same bait in front of you every day. If it works, I think you should expect a steady diet of whatever that is. I think he'll just keep putting that same bait in front of you until you learn to walk away. But you could always walk away. I mean, Scripture is real clear about that. You're never a victim of that sort of thing. You're never so weak that you can't do what you want to do. The free will that God gives each one of us is always in your possession. You're not a slave. And any one of you at any moment could say, I'm going to go a different direction. I'm going to get back on the right course. You could. And you can't blame God for it if you're off the wrong course, because God doesn't put anybody there. Instead, James says, after desire, we hunger for something. After it's conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when it's full grown, he says, it gives birth to death. It always grows. It always gets bigger. It's like it gestates kind of inside of us and gets bigger and gets stronger and becomes more of a thing. And you see that all the time, right? A teenager is out and does something he shouldn't do or she shouldn't do, and they come back and the parents are suspicious. Hey, what have you been into? What's going on? Oh, nothing. I just, doing this and this and this. So now you've got another lie there on top of everything else you're doing. Or a husband or wife does that. They've kind of violated their promises to each other, but instead of owning up to it, they just hide it and try to disguise it and all sort. Maybe get angry. Are you doing this again? Oh, I can't believe you're accusing me. What kind of? I'm not even. I refuse to even talk about this again. And you angry and stonewalling and hateful. And so the one sin, it grows. I read a thing this week. Richard Nixon, when he accepted the Republican nomination in 1968, he said, let's begin by committing ourselves to the truth, to see it like it is and tell it like it is and find the truth and speak the truth and live the truth. And then 10 years later, Nixon quoted again, says, when a president does it, it's not illegal. Well, how do you get from the first thing to the second thing? How do you get from the first stuff to the second stuff? Well, you start thinking the rules don't apply to you. And honestly, if you would think about almost any of our recent presidents, is it hard for you to imagine they don't think that same way? And not just the presidents, executives at your work, the boss at work. Don't you see that there's something about us as people that if I have the power to get away with it, I can start telling myself that the rules don't really apply to me like they do everybody else. Yeah, I agree that this is a little dangerous, but I can handle it. Yeah, I agree this might be a little bit risky, but I can do it. Maybe your problem, but I'm doing it just fine. It doesn't really affect me at all. There's just something about when that desire gets a hold of us and we start to cultivate it, it grows. And we start to find reasons to excuse what was a little thing. J.C. Ryle is a theologian. He said, there's nothing little that concerns our souls. And I agree with that. You might think it's a little thing, but if it's your soul we're talking about, man, what sacrifice is worth that? What risk is worth your soul? Especially when there's a right way to go and you don't have to go the wrong direction. Back to James. He says, don't be deceived, brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift comes from God, from the Father of heavenly lights. He doesn't change. In other words, the God who loved you at the beginning still loves you now. The God who called you, the God who died on a cross in the person of Jesus Christ, he's still on your side. And he's not wanting you to fail, and he's not wanting you to get smacked down. And he doesn't give up on us. Doesn't mean that there's not sometimes we might have a reason to be ashamed, but we can always hold our head up with God because he loves us. And he invites any one of us to come back. And God never, doesn't matter what temptation you struggle with, doesn't matter what temptation has knocked you down. God doesn't want you to quit, because there's a right way. I heard a sermon where they were comparing God to like a policeman. And I don't agree with this idea at all, but the illustration was that God has got that radar detector out, and he's all the time watching, and he knows when you violate it. He's just out there, going to check and see. And I guess there's some truth to that in the sense that God knows when you violate his holiness. God's going to be aware of it when you break the rules. But this idea that God's just waiting for you to fail. I know sooner or later you're going to, and I got the radar gun out. I'm going to catch you. As soon as you make a mistake, I'm going to catch you, and I'm going to be all over you. I don't think that at all describes how God acts. Romans says that God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, while we were enemies of God, we were as far from God as a person could be, Christ died for us. I mean, imagine, if you can, a person becomes a Christian, say when they're 18 years old. When they're 18 years old and they understand the truth of the gospel, Jesus makes sense to them, they say, okay, I want that in my life. I see it. Your eyes are open. You see the course of life that God has laid out. This is what I want to be. And so they make a decision to become a Christian, and they're baptized. And at that moment, before they made that decision, this verse says they were as far from God as they could be. But they made that decision, and they go through college, and they meet somebody in college, and they get married, and it's not the easiest marriage. It's a little challenging. It's a little difficult, and there's been a lot of bad stuff happen in the marriage, and a lot of compromises on both sides. And now this 18-year-old is 28, and he looks at his last, especially 5 or 6 years, and man, there's no way God could love me now. But you're much further along with him than you were then. And if he loved you here when you had nothing going on, why wouldn't you think he still loves you here? I mean, you may be flawed. You may have some mistakes. You may have made a few bad decisions. And maybe some of those bad decisions have ballooned. It wasn't just the one bad decision, but it's grown into a lot of bad decisions, because sin does that. It's one of the defining qualities of sin. And it grows, and now it's become a bigger deal. But God's not given up on you. God's not quit on you. You don't even be mad at God. I mean, he's still as much for you here as he was here. Proverbs chapter 19 says, a person's own folly leads to their ruin, but they rage against the Lord. It's their own decision to do whatever things they did. They made their own decisions, and they lived their own life, and they did whatever they wanted, and sometimes did whatever they wanted and kind of ignored God for years. And then all of a sudden it's blowing up in their face, and they're mad at God about it. Like, God, how could you let me do this? And I find that for most of the stupid things I do, there was this voice in the back of my head, and sometimes a friend or a couple friends who have come and been a loud voice in my ear saying, hey, are you sure this is what you want to do? And I just charge ahead stupid anyway. God normally speaks right up, and we just don't want to hear it. Don't be mad at God. The very first stories in the Bible are about Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are in the garden, and they've got everything given to them. The whole world is theirs. God says there's only one thing you can't do. You can't eat this one tree of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil, you can't eat that. Anything else is open game. And you might wonder, well, why would God even put a tree like that there? I mean, God's planting all the trees. Why even plant a tree like that? And the people debate about that. But what I think is that tree is your escape hatch if you want it. God says, I've given you everything. It's all there. All you got to do is walk the way I tell you. This is the way to walk. But if you decide, God says, you'd like to decide for yourself what's up and down. You'd like to decide for yourself what's good and what's evil, then just grab this fruit off the tree and eat it, and that'll be the sign. And because God does that in Scripture. Baptism is a thing he does that with. I mean, there's nothing magic about the water, but a person goes up and they're baptized, and they come up, and your sins are washed away. And the water, like I said, nothing magic that actually is sin-washing water, but you go under and you come out, and when you make that decision physically, your body's doing all those things, you're announcing to the world spiritually, I'm on a different path now. right? I was going this direction, now I'm going to go this direction. And there's something powerful about that in your own heart and in the lives of the people around you. And this tree of good and evil was the same thing, but kind of in reverse. If a person said, I don't want to do it God's way, you could take the fruit and you could eat it. Well, one day, Eve is in the garden, and there's a talking snake. And it's one of those stories that people say, well, see, the Bible's fairy tales. And I can appreciate that you would think such a thing. But the thinking is that in Eden, it was different. It was perfect. I mean, there was just no sin, and maybe talking animals were a thing, or snakes. I don't know. I know, talking snake or not, if I had been Eve, you would be safe. I would have ran the other direction. But Eve stays there and has a conversation with the snake. And the snake says, did God say you couldn't eat this tree that I'm slithering around in here? And no, he said, we can't even touch that tree. And the snake says, well, I think God's trying to keep something back from you. He said, this tree won't kill you. He said, if you eat this tree, you'll be smart as God, which is not entirely a lie, because you'll get to decide for yourself what's right and wrong. It was a lie, but it's not entirely a lie. And Eve thinks about this thing, and so she takes a bite. And I don't know if she really totally understood what she was getting herself into there, but she takes a bite. And she gets her husband, says her husband's right there with her, gets him to take a bite too. And I don't know if Adam had heard the whole conversation or if he's just minding his own business, picking at his toes there. And she says, hey, eat some fruit. All right. And he grabs it, and he like, because Julie does it to me all the time. Here, eat this. All right. And I'll eat it, and I don't. So it could be that kind of thing. Or maybe he knows exactly what he's doing. But either way, once they eat the fruit, it says their eyes are opened, and the whole world is kind of off balance all of a sudden. They're not at peace with the world. They're not at peace with each other. They realize they're naked, they say, and they put clothes on. They don't want the other to see them, Shame creeps in there that had never been in there before, and embarrassment and pride and all these other. And they start hiding from each other, and they start hiding from God. When God comes to the garden, where are you? Where are you guys? And we hid. We hid, says Adam, because we knew we was naked and we was embarrassed about it. And so God says, how'd you know you was naked? He says, have you eaten from that tree that I commanded you not to eat from? And Adam says, well, the woman you gave me, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit and the tree and I ate it. Now, who's Adam blaming for this? Well, he's blaming her, right? But he's blaming God. I just minded my own business, God, playing video games and naming animals. And then you put this woman here in my path. I didn't ask for her. I didn't want her to come around. You did this to me. And that's what we do, right? It's never our fault. And that goes back all the way to the very first story in the Bible. It's never our fault. We always want to blame everybody else for it, and sometimes want to blame God for it. Why'd you make me like this? Why'd you put me in this family? Why did you put me in this town? Why did you make my money like it is? Why did you make my face like it is? Why did you make me think like I do? And it's just sin. And James says, we don't have to go into those things. We don't have to jump into those holes. We have power. The last verse we'll look at today in James, he says, he chose to give us birth. Remember earlier, sin gives birth to death. Now, he's given us a whole new course of life. He chose to give us birth. The same way that sin grows into something, Jesus can grow into something inside of us. He says he chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruit of all he created. There is a truth. There's a right way. And he's given it to us. That's what Scripture's about. There is a right way. There's other ways to do it. Some of those ways will look pretty good, but there is a right way. And when you choose to walk away from that right way, don't we know how big a deal truth is? Like in our relationships? A husband and a wife, and maybe the husband's made some bad decisions, and the wife's a little suspicious of those bad decisions. Hey, what have you been doing here? And he makes up some little lie to get away with it, right? Oh, well, you're seeing this all wrong. It's really like this. And as he's saying the little lie, he says, she's never going to buy this in his head. But she does. She believes it. Oh, okay. And she walks away, and he thinks, Phew, I've made my life better. And you've not made your life better because she's no longer in love with you. She's in love with this character you created. It's not you anymore. It's not true anymore. I mean, for it to be real, it has to be true. I mean, there has to be, for it to be real at all, it has to be true. I have to know when everything else is falling apart, I can count on you. I have to know that you might be funny, you might tell me jokes, you might get, but if push comes to shove, I know I can count on you to tell me the truth. That's the only kind of relationship that's worth anything. And I tell parents who have kids, I mean, sometimes the parent has gotten into a fight because they find out some awful thing about the kid, and it's just become this huge wedge in the relationship. And you know, the very worst thing is not you finding out the awful thing. The very worst thing is you never finding out the awful thing, and just being lies. And I know the lies make us all happier, but it's not real. I mean, I don't want somebody that I love to get into trouble, but if they're going to get in trouble, they can't be scared to talk to me about it. I mean, if we've got that kind of relationship based on fear where they know that anything in the world could set me off, well, I don't want that. I mean, and God certainly doesn't want that. And God knew exactly what he was getting into you when you came along. He knew who you were. He knew what you were. He knew what you were about. And he took you on anyway. While we were still sinners, he came and took us in. How much more is he going to love and want to hold on to us now after we've been in this thing so long? So open up your heart. You know, for most of us, like I said, there's a voice in the back of our head telling us what to do. There's people in our lives helping us. It's just a matter of committing again to get on the path. And if you've been a person who's kind of ignored that for a while, it may be hard to make it right. And I can respect that. But don't give up on that. There's a right way. This world made by God in heaven, there's a right way to live. And when you vary from that, it can work for a while. It can. There's just always a hook in it. And our God, I think, wants to bring you back. There's a preacher named George Fall, and he used to have such great stories. He's passed away now, but he used to have such great stories. And one of his stories was about a sheik, an Arabian sheik in the desert, and he would be out with the flocks and his herds and things he did all day long. And then the best part of his day, he would come back into the tent at night. He had this big barrel of figs, and he would just eat figs while the breeze would blow through the tent. Because in the desert, you can have such a big temperature shift during the day, 100 degrees during the day, and then 60 at night, and that's every day. And he would sit in there in the cool of and the wind's blowing through the tent, and he would eat his figs. He's his best part of his day. So he takes the first fig and he eats it, and it doesn't taste right. So he kind of puts it up into the candle there where you can look at it and see what's going on. Well, there's a worm in it. Well, half a worm in it. And so he tosses that out, and he gets the second fig out, and he looks at it. Well, there's a worm in that one too. And the third fig, well, there's 2 worms in that one. And it's like the best part of his day, and now there's all these worms in it. And he pulls out another one, and there's a worm in that one. It finally made him so mad, George Fall said, that he blew the candle out. It was easier not to know. Right? Now he didn't know, right? Was there still worms in there? Well, sure. He just didn't know. Now, I think God's here to whisper to you what's right. I think God's here to tell you what's right. I think there's a right way to live. And I think if you make a decision to follow hard after God in that, He'll take you where you need to go. At the end of our service, at the end of every service, we have some people who will be up in the front and they'll pray with you. And this would be a great time to pray about any of those kinds of things. If there's any of those kinds of things in your heart, to say, hey, pray for me about this or that. And it may seem like a little thing to you, but there are no little things when it comes to our soul, right? So if it's something that's kind of in there bothering you, do it. And if it's one of those things which you're sitting there and you should pray about it, but you don't have the courage to do it, that should always make you a little nervous when you're hearing the voice, but it's easy to ignore the voice because I I don't think there's a guarantee that voice will always be as loud as it is right now. So if you feel it, take advantage of that. Come pray about this. Or pray with the people beside you there as we're singing. But don't just hold that inside. Maybe nothing going on. But I still invite you to come here and pray at the end of the service. Pray for our church. Pray for other people that they can get back on the path. I really do think in our country, so many people have wandered so far from the path, they can't even see where it is anymore. But God has given us a word of truth, and He's called us to be followers of Him. And if we make a decision to put Him first, we can get right back on, no matter how far astray you are. Let me pray with you, and I'll have the band come back up. Won't you stand up? I'll pray with you, have the band come back up. Dear Lord God, I pray right now for this group. I pray, Father, for any of them who know that they've kind of walked away from you a little bit, or maybe a lot. And I just pray, God, that you call them back to you. Call them, God, to draw close to you. Call them, God, to lean on you. I pray for anybody here, God, who needs to make some things right, that you use this time at the end of the service to give them inspiration to do that. And I also pray, God, for those people who maybe there's nothing going on, but they feel your Spirit stirring, and they know that our church needs, God, to follow you harder than we've been, and our town, God, needs to follow you harder than we've been. Give them a heart, God, to call out to you and say, here I am. Send me, use me, God. Help me to be somebody who can make a difference. I pray, Father, for this time that you do business with us.